Hello, quilters! Thank you for joining me. My name is Jared Cahoon, and this is our last Quilt Canada 2021 presentation. We have a lovely presentation lined up for us by the fabulous Leah Day. This is You Can Quilt Superslide Ruler. If you've been following along, you may have watched several Leah Day videos before this. She does a fabulous job teaching you a whole bunch of different techniques and about how to make use of different patterns. And I'm so excited to see what she has in store for us in relation to the Superslide ruler. This is actually a ruler that she designed, and she would know best, I guess, how it's to be used. If you have any questions, feel free to comment them down below, and I will answer them during the video. Or if there's some good questions, I will hold them till the end. This is going to be our last presentation of the 2021 Quilt Canada. If you're interested in seeing more presentations coming to you in Canada, just, again, comment down below, call us, contact your local dealer, and let them know. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, or if you're watching this later, you can always call our toll-free number, and we would be happy to speak with you. Well, that's enough of my rambling. Let's get over to Leah Day, and let's learn together how to use the Superslide quilting ruler. All right, here she is.
Hello, my quilting friends. My name is Leah Day, and welcome back to Grace Company's Spring Fling Quilt Festival. In this video, we're going to learn how to quilt matrix with rulers. I'm going to be using the Superslide ruler that I designed for Grace Company, and we are going to learn how to quilt this in narrow spaces like sashing. This is a beautiful wiggly grid design. It's perfect to quilt in sashing or borders. It's also a terrific design to stitch over entire blocks. So here I'm going to show you how to quilt this on a 1-inch scale, also on a 1/2-inch scale, and even shrink it down a little bit more to a 1/4-inch scale. You can do all of this with this ruler. So let's jump right in and get started. So the first thing to understand about ruler quilting is the math behind it. The first thing we use is a ruler foot. The needle should be in the center position, and this is a 1/2-inch round foot so that you end up with exactly a 1/4-inch spacing from your needle to the edge of the foot. So if I was to line up the ruler here right with the edge and then stitch another line parallel to it, then they would end up with 1/4-inch spacing just going off the spacing on the foot itself. So I'm going to get started stitching matrix into this 8-inch square, and I want to quilt these lines 1 inch apart. I want a fairly big scale. This would be for a bed quilt, for a cuddly quilt, something soft, and it'd be a great choice for filling in blocks. So here we go. I'm going to count over from the edge, 1, 2, 3. So 3 etched lines from the edge is 3/4 of an inch. So that is 3/4 of an inch plus a 1/4 inch on my foot. That is going to equal 1 inch. So the very first line, I don't have to worry about that. I can just set my line wherever it's going to go. But when I go to space my lines, meaning stitch the next one, that's when I really need to worry about that. All right, so first thing I'm going to do is stitch my curve. And this Superslide ruler is special because I've designed it so that you've got the same curve on both sides. It's a special thing. I'll explain why in a bit, as far as why is that really necessary to have the same curve on both sides. It's also continuous, meaning that if you stop at this line, which is 1/4 inch from the end, and on this line, which is 1/4 inch from the end, well then the curve continues. So if I line this up here, or even better, I can flip it around, and as you can see, that curve, if I have this with the middle position right where my needle is, you can see how my line is spacing out exactly a 1/4 inch away from that edge, and that looks just right. So in many ways, I've designed this so that you can stitch continuous curves, you can stitch continuous lines, and it's really easy because of the etched lines on the ruler. It allows you to line things up really easily and nicely. Okay, So now I'm going to travel stitch along the edge, and I am kind of mentally thinking about that full 1 inch. So I'm going to actually have to travel stitch over this way and travel stitch down a bit, because 1 inch spacing, you know, I basically need to visualize behind my foot here 3/4 of an inch. And until I get that spacing, I basically need to keep stitching away from that line. And I need to line this up so I have it roughly lined up with the lines before. And running parallel. There we go. And it looks like I'm about there. Okay. So obviously we have curved lines for the first 2 edge lines, and then after that we have a straight line. So this is a little bit trickier to line up, but as you can see down here and right here, I can line up a straight line, that third, 1, 2, 3, third line from the edge, okay? And I'm also over here lining up my foot, making sure my foot is staying in good contact with that ruler. Ruler quilting depends on 2 things. Number 1, following the edge lines on your ruler. The other thing that it requires is for you to keep the ruler foot in contact with your ruler. And I had a little bit of a wobble over here. That's okay. Not the end of the world. All right, I'm going to flip my ruler because this is a pretty long block. And that allows me to keep my hand in the middle. You know, things can get a little tippy, but if you keep your hand roughly in the middle of the ruler, you're going to really minimize that kind of tippiness, that tending towards rocking the ruler up or down, which can also throw off your lines. All right, this looks good. I have just that little bit left. Keep the foot and the ruler in good connection all the way to the end. And there you see, we've got 2 parallel lines roughly 1 inch apart. And 1 inch, I always kind of, guesstimate it. I can put a 2 fingers width between inch spacing. All right, now I'm going to stitch along the edge. Now, if this was a block and this was a ditch, then I'd just be travel stitching in the ditch. No big deal. That's absolutely allowed. Helps us to minimize those pesky thread breaks, right? So yes, you can always travel stitch in the ditch. That's absolutely allowed. And then at any point in time, you want to take your time getting your ruler in position. You know, this is the thing that can take a little bit of extra time. You want to just visually be looking at those lines, looking at the edge lines on the ruler, making sure everything's lined up nicely with what you stitched before. You might have to stitch back a little bit in order to make contact with the ruler, and then work to keep that foot in good connection with the ruler. You can see my little wobble right here. That was caused because I let the foot drift a little bit from the edge of the ruler, and of course then it didn't stitch a perfect line. It didn't stitch perfect spacing. Alrighty, so now I'm visualizing. I gotta say, inch spacing is a little bit more tricky. If I was doing 3/4 inch spacing, that would be a little easier because I'd be lined up with a curve on my ruler. But when you want to do that inch spacing and get a really soft quilt, then I want to show you how to be able to do that. So this looks good. And here's another thing. It doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be absolutely exact, because as you see, the spacing of the lines is very forgiving. So it's not the end of the world if you have lines that, kind of come together a little bit closer or spread apart a little further. Not the end of the world. Okay, so it looks like I need to stitch down just a few more stitches. There we go. Like I said, sometimes you want to just stitch down a little further than you think, because then it allows you more space to get your ruler in the right position here. And I'm lining up down here. I've got a little straight line that I can line up 3 from the edge right there, and then back here behind the foot I can line up 2. There we go. I need to stitch back a bit, connect with my ruler, maintain good spacing with the ruler, and then turn the ruler around so that way I can maintain that and also keep my hand in the middle of the ruler too. There we go. Really nice. Okay, so far we're just stitching curvy lines, right? And you could totally fill up blocks really nicely with evenly spaced curvy lines. That's absolutely allowed and a very pretty design in its own right. But I want to go ahead and get some matrix stitched here. And matrix is basically a wiggly grid. So we stitch curvy lines going in one direction, and then we stitch curvy lines going in the opposite direction. So I'm going to stitch one more line here, get to this corner, and then we're going to start that curvy line going across. And it's really easy. It's basically the exact same process what we've just done, but just working in the opposite direction. And the only thing that can be challenging is this, that you've already got some lines stitched, and it can get a little confusing. It can get a little bit where it's like, okay, what am I stitching now? You know, how am I stitching this? You know, what direction am I going in? But the biggest thing is think grid, meaning that I have lines going basically on the diagonal this way. Now I want lines basically going on the diagonal in the opposite direction. So there's no real right or wrong way of doing it. Just put your ruler down and stitch that first line. Now, a few things about ruler quilting that I haven't covered yet. Number one, you want to have your ruler in your non-dominant hand. So I am left-handed, so I have my ruler being held by my right hand. That way I can control the machine and have the handlebars set up for my left hand, and I'm steering the machine with my left hand. So steering the machine, I think, does need to have your dominant hand in control. The other thing I have is I have my stitch length set at 16 stitches per inch. I am on a Unique 21, so I have that wonderful stitch regulator, and I am using regulated crews. I have played around with precise too. Both of them are great settings, but I have been really liking regulated crews, that mode, for ruler quilting. So here we go. All right, we've got our lines stitched. I stitched over to get my spacing going. And then now, hopefully you can see this a little bit better. I'm going with 1 to 3rd line from the edge, and it is a straight line. I've filled up the inside of the ruler with straight lines versus more curves, just because I thought that might make some other designs like flowing lines and some other fun things that you can do with this ruler really easy. So I'm lining up that edge line with that deepest part of the curve, and then down here I've also got a straight line I can line up with that deepest part of the curve too. So there we go. Keep the foot and the ruler in great connection as I stitch on down. Now at any point in time you're like, oh wow, you know, I'm putting all my pressure over here. It doesn't really feel like I've got a lot of, you know, stability. You know, it's kind of, it's getting out of control. I feel like I might tip. Take the ruler, turn it around, get it back in position. Don't just keep stitching when it feels uncomfortable. This goes for, you know, quilting on a home sewing machine too. Anytime you start stitching and feeling uncomfortable about something, that's going to probably end up making bad looking stitches. You got to be comfortable both moving your quilt on a home machine or moving your long arm on a frame. Either way, you got to be comfortable with what you're doing. You got to be able to see what you're doing and make that, you know, make that smooth movement. That's what free motion quilting always requires, a smooth, free movement. There we go, I stitched up, and here again you can see that straight line's lined up with the center of that curve. This looks good. And again, let's say your spacing was ever so slightly off, you know, things just weren't working out all that well. You can see just how big and open this grid is. It's very forgiving. It's not the end of the world. In fact, actually, this is so open, I'm not going to bother stitching another little curvy line in here because I just really don't think that we need it. Instead, I'm going to stitch back here and start working my curves in the opposite direction. So this is how I would fill a block. I usually start on the diagonal, and then I work in one direction until I get to a corner. Then I work the other direction until I get to the other corner, and then I come back to that first angle and go back to filling in that way. Looks like I need to stitch a few stitches that way in good position. This time I'm hooking my thumb on the edge of the ruler and I'm pressing with all my fingers, and I'm kind of pushing the ruler right up against that ruler foot. So it's adding a good bit of tension there, and that is definitely helping me control that movement and keep the ruler in good position. I rotated it around. This is one of those, many reasons why you have the same curve on both sides of the ruler, is that at any point in time, if it starts feeling funny, rotate it around, you have so much more control. There we go. All right, back to that side. Now I'm going to stitch up, and just visually, I'm just looking at the spacing and going, okay, there's the line, there's the edge of my foot. That kind of roughly looks like 3/4 of an inch. Let's check it. And then I line up that straight edge line, 3 from the edge, with the deepest part of that curve, and that looks good. Hold my hand in place and stitch across. Woo! As you can see, my ruler is kind of tipping up. You got to watch out for that. My ruler base ends about right here. And so the Superslide ruler is a little bit on the long side, so watch out for tipping up. Again, if it starts to do something funky, rotate it around. Don't let it tip up on you. And, you know, you can always click off your machine. That is absolutely allowed. Don't ever feel like you've got to like leave it running, you know, or pedal to the metal, or just, you know, keep flying through it. You know, ruler quilting is slower. I'll just be perfectly honest. You know, we've already quilted a free motion filler design, basic spiral. That's a really quick design that, you know, flows really fast. If you're wanting to go for speed, I would say, you know, something like that, a filler design is probably going to be a better choice. A ruler quilting design is always going to be slower because you've got travel stitching involved, you've got ruler placement involved, you've got exact stitching involved. And all of those things, yes, slow you down a little bit. So if you've got 100 baby quilts to knock out this month, then I would say ruler quilting probably isn't going to be the best choice, although it's really, really fun and it's enjoyable to play with. It is slower. It's going to be for that special baby quilt, that quilt that's, you've just been waiting on that grandbaby for years and years and years, and you really want to stitch it up a notch and just make it extra special. That is what this design is for. Or show quilting, you could definitely do some fun things with show quilting with this design too. All right, so inevitably you're going to end up with a weird wonky ankle that you've got to stitch in, and there's no getting around it. This just happens when you're ruler quilting. You're going to have to hold the ruler and, kind of here behind the machine. It's kind of awkward. I'm going to stitch basically to the middle, and then I'm going to reposition the ruler. And no, this doesn't feel all that great, but it is stable. It's not shifting. And this is the longest angle because, this is basically, the corner to corner diagonal. So it's not like it's going to last forever. Just understand that when ruler quilting, sometimes you're going to have to hold your hand or hold the ruler in kind of an awkward position. This just happens, and we just make the best of it. Remember to keep your machine, keep your ruler foot in great contact with the edge of that ruler. Mine's done a little bit of slippage with this line. That's not the end of the world, but try and keep the ruler and the foot in great connection. Here we go. Slide that back. It's not perfect, but it's definitely good enough. Okay, now I'm going to travel stitch down and over. And this is the reason why, straight edges really makes travel stitching along edge of the block, edge of a design, edge, stitch in the ditch, whatever you need to do, you can just quickly rotate it around and be able to stitch that. There we go. Now, what if this was just, so awkward, just absolutely impossible for you? Well, you do have a few options. I mean, if you wanted to reload your quilt on the frame in a different angle, yes, you could. That would be a rather time-consuming solution on a continuum frame, but a little bit easier if you were using a hoop frame, obviously, because you just have to shift your quilt around and rehoop it. So that wouldn't be the end of the world, and it's definitely open to you. There's lots of different options here. One thing would be, just to think through these angles before you get started. And this might be easier if I had stitched it the different way so that the lines were horizontal and vertical versus on the diagonal. But really, this isn't so bad. As you can see, I'm managing to get them in here even with the awkward angle. And it's not, it's not too wonky. So here we go. Couple more lines. Line this up. This time I'm going to try it this way. I'm only going to stitch a couple inches, then I'll shift my hand down. Obviously, we don't want to get too close. There we go. Rotate it around. This looks good. Although, I gotta say, I actually prefer because I can put my whole arm on the quilt, and that kind of gives me a little bit more pressure and resistance. You know, I can add that little bit of pressure downward, and that helps me control the machine a little bit. So I really, you know, as awkward as it looks, I know, I actually prefer this over having my hand to the front. And you might be thinking, okay, well, why don't you just switch hands? You know, put your left hand on the ruler, right hand on the machine. Well, I would have to reverse my buttons, and I'm just not as good at it that way. I don't steer the machine with my right hand normally, and I don't hold the ruler in my left hand normally. So it would be the opposite of what I'm used to, and most likely I would stitch some pretty ugly stitches. So there we go. And as I said, you know, it's only been, what, 4 lines? And really, we're getting through that awkward space. And the thing about, I've definitely noticed with quilting is, you know, you might have an awkward area for a little bit, but it doesn't last. You know, you get through it pretty quick. Just keep on adding those lines, keep on stitching, and you'll knock it out, and then you won't have to you won't even think about it. You won't even think about that awkward angle, that, you know, how you had to hold the ruler upside down or sideways or whatever. It's just not going to even bug you anymore. All right, one more line and I think we're done. There we go. Okay, so you can see that, yes, Matrix is a little bit on the time-consuming side, but I really think that this texture is worth it. It is really, really pretty. It's a great choice for blocks. Now let's check it out and see what it looks like when we stitch it in narrow sashing or borders. So here is Matrix filled in a little bit in narrow sashing. This is about 2 inches wide. So I've already established a design, and I want to show you how I quilt it into a narrow area. And this is a little bit of back and forth. I do a little bit in one direction, and then I do a little bit in another direction. So the first thing I'm going to do is line up my ruler, and this is 1/2 inch Matrix. So I'm going to line up my ruler with the previous line of stitching on the first etched line. So here we go. I line that up, and I'm just setting the ruler where it fits the line before. I'm just making sure that that etched line that I quilted before is lining up with the previous, sorry, the stitched line that I quilted before is lined up with that edged line on the ruler. And so that is giving me 1/4 inch, plus the ruler foot is giving me 1/4 inch, resulting in 1/2 inch space lines. So I stitch in one direction, and then I'm off the edge of the quilt so I can be a little sloppy with that stitching as I go across. And then I line up my ruler again and stitch down. So I usually will quilt 1 or 2 lines in one direction, and then that usually spaces me out in the perfect position to stitch in the opposite direction. So here I'm going to stitch back a bit. So I'm just using that straight edge of the ruler. The reason I had these ends straight is so that way you can quickly and easily stitch in the ditch or stitch along an edge of a block or something like that. There we go. And now I'm lining up with the other line. So this is a different curve. As you can see, I position the ruler a little bit differently in order to line up with that curve. Stitch over. And I hope you can see that, yeah, this is a little bit more time consuming. If you watch the other video on how to quilt this beautiful basic spiral design, then you see how this is just a little bit more time consuming, because of course we've got careful travel stitching always. Anytime that you have travel stitching in design, that's always going to take a little bit more time, because of course then you want that to be done carefully and for it to look good and not messy. I have to continue stitching over until I get the right angle, and I don't know if it's the right angle until I get my ruler on it, and then I can see, oh, okay, that lines up, okay. I just basically keep stitching over until the line on my ruler lines up with that previously stitched line. If it doesn't line up, then it's not ready. I haven't stitched over far enough, basically. And as you can see, it's kind of tilting as I go. I'm getting more and more of that curve and that's extending more that way. I'm actually going to continue, and I'll show you that you can actually, if you want to, you could just continue stitching one part of the design, so just in one direction. And you could play with this as far as just maybe even quilt a border where only part of it has the doubled effect. Only part of it has, you know, lines going in both directions. More of the design, more of the border is stitched with only one set of lines. And I think that looks really cool. You know, you can really play around with this and come up with lots of different cool effects. You could even go inside of your matrix, inside of that grid, and fill in the spaces. So that's something that I have seen in quilt shows and stuff where, and it's, let's just put it this way, it's definitely a show quilting technique because it is time consuming to go inside and fill in those little spaces. Now this is a tricky spot. As you can see, my ruler is getting to a point where I'm running out of curve. So I'm right here, right on the tip of that ruler. Remember, the Superslide ruler is double-sided, so the same curve on one side, you have the mirror curve on the other. So I flip this around, and what you'll find is now, instead of being right on that edge, I'm in the middle on the other side. So it's exact same curve on both sides. I did that intentionally because if you have two different curves, well, that doesn't really do you much good when you're running out of ruler and you really need something more to grip and hang on to. So you can see how this effect starts to look. You just get that nice undulating line, and this is a neat effect. Let's say, you know, you just really wanted that denser effect in only one space. You didn't want it to be quite this dense through the entire quilt, the entire stashing, so you could just leave off and just go with nice curvy lines in one direction. Now I mentioned that kind of show quilting technique. You could go in and you could fill these with, like, here's just kind of like a wiggly spiral. You could do some dense stippling. It would, as I said, be time consuming and it would be filling every other one. Here's just kind of a wiggly wobbly fill, and then maybe I'll try a different direction for this one. Something kind of random. Yeah, as you can see, that could be a whole rabbit hole of fun things to play with. It's really just dependent upon the style of your quilt and how much quilting that you want to do, you know? There's no real right or wrong way of doing it, but you got to think about the purpose of your quilt. You know, what is it being quilted for? I would not fill a bed quilt ever this densely because this is really show quilting level. You know, this is going to be super dense. This is not going to be something cuddly or fun to curl up with on the couch, right? Let's say you wanted to get out of an area, you're just trying something out and you have a lot of travel stitching to do. Definitely grab your ruler so that you have the most control as you stitch out of that space. That's always going to be your friend. All right, so let's talk about another show quilting technique if you really wanted to stitch it up a notch. What happens if you decide to really bring these lines closer together? Like you wanted this to be even denser, even tighter, really punch up that texture. Well, the simplest way to do that is to shrink your scale. So whereas before my lines were 1/2 inch apart, I was lining up this line that is 1 from the edge, so the edge line that is 1 from the edge of the ruler, and that was giving me a 1/2 inch spacing. So now, instead of doing that, I'm going to line up the edge of the ruler with that line of stitching. So now I'm only getting that 1/4 inch. I'm getting a 1/4 inch just off the ruler foot running up against the edge of the ruler. Isn't that cute? Okay, now I stitch over. Careful travel stitching, and this is actually easier to eyeball, and if you're brand new to ruler quilting, then I think 1/4 inch spacing is kind of a good idea just to play with, because it's easier to visualize. All you do is you stitch over until the edge of your foot is lined up with the edge of your stitching. And then you line up your ruler with your stitching. So it's a lot easier to think about. You know, there's no math really. You just line up edge to edge. So edge of the ruler on the edge of the stitching, edge of the foot on the edge of the stitching, edge of the ruler on that stitching as well. Click on the machine and stitch on down. There we go. And then now, just because I'm way over here, I'm not going to bother stitching over. I want to show you how this looks when you start making it denser. So actually I'm going to stitch up one more. So I'm going to stitch over. I'm going to stitch up, and then I will start doing my stitching across in the opposite direction. There we go. Come over a bit, you know, and the point is a grid. You know, we really want it, you know, I'm making this kind of an X on the diagonal here. You could also do vertical if you wanted to, but I really like that angle that we get when it's kind of an X shape. So here we go. Remember, you can always just get started, just, you know, create that new line. It's really that simple. All right, now stitch over. Only need to go over that 1/4 inch. Shift my ruler back into position. There we go. And I got off a little bit, obviously. That's a little bit of a demented, curve. It kind of winged out a little bit. I think that was because I wasn't pushing the foot right up against my ruler. That's very easy to do. So when I'm lining up the ruler this time, what I'm going to make sure I do is line up the edge line with the correct line. The correct line is here, right? So I want to make sure to line up the ruler with that line to make sure that this next one is not off too. And I think I also had the ruler kind of slightly, it might not have been in the perfect position. So there we go. Actually, no, it's still, I think I'm just not coming out far enough. This is the other thing about a curve. You've got to keep in mind that, you know, as this wings out and gets deeper this way, sometimes you really need to give yourself a little bit more space and stitch further down, get your ruler in the right position, and then come back. And this is easier to do when you're on the edge of the quilt. You can kind of make a mess on that edge of the quilt, and no one's going to know because, of course, you're going to cut that off, and that's going to be covered up with binding. So, yeah, that was a total hash of it. It does not look good. But as you can see, yes, I make mistakes. Yes, I, you know, have errors in my quilting too. Don't worry about it. Keep on going. Of course, if this was a super, super special quilt that you're wanting to turn into an heirloom, then I might consider ripping that out. But, you know, this is just a practice sandwich for me just to play, so I'm not going to bother. And I'm just going to keep on quilting and show you this 1/4 inch spacing that's really cute. There we go. Shift that ruler over a bit. There we go. I might even be getting a little bit of ruler tilt. You see how much space I've, you know, basically got to cover here. That much area at that angle. It might have been wiser to have the, you know, have it be less angled. I might be having an easier job of it because it might actually be shifting as I stitch halfway through the second half. You know, I'm kind of subtly shifting my hand. That might be the culprit there. But as you can see, as your lines come together, as they crisscross, minor issues, minor mistakes are not very noticeable. They really kind of come out in the wash, they blend together, and particularly if you use thread that wasn't quite as contrasting as I'm using. Now I don't advise matching perfectly, because that's like quilting in the dark, but definitely a more subtle contrast like a bright pink thread or a light purple thread would probably not show this quite as boldly. You know, it would be a little bit more subtle. Whew, I just totally invented a new line. So another big key is you've got to keep the ruler foot connected to the ruler. So I was focusing more on this hand, and I had my hand nice and firmly pressed down, and it was, you know, behaving well, but I was not pushing with my other hand against the foot and making sure that it stayed in contact with the ruler. So of course then my line is wildly off. So big tip for ruler quilting is these two have got to stay in connection. They have got to stay together. Otherwise you're going to end up with a totally random line. And this is another good point, is that you don't have to use a ruler for matrix. This can also be a freehand design. So here, I'm just going to freehand this. You can see how this speeds up, but it's also not as, It's not as formulaic, you know, obviously. It's going to be a lot more random, a lot more organic, and it just depends on you which style you like better. If you like more of a design that follows a repeating pattern, then you're gonna like the ruler. If you like to flow, if you like speed, you know, if you wanna just be able to just get on your machine and just go, then maybe freehand quilting is more your thing. I would say if this was a ditch on a block, instead of just winging it, I would definitely be grabbing my ruler and using that to help me travel stitch either the end of this ruler or the ditcher ruler to help me keep that nice and neat. But I want you to see also that Matrix is not just a ruler quilting design. I've been quilting this freehand on my quilts for years and years, so you can also stitch this with no marks, with no ruler. Just simply stitch a curvy line in one direction, stitch a curvy line in another direction. And again, I do about 2 lines, and then I'll change direction and stitch the other 2 lines. Just like so. Very, very fun. Matrix has so many possibilities. I can't wait to see how you stitch this pretty design in your quilts. So that's it for this video. I hope you learned a lot quilting Matrix with me and seeing how you can stitch this both with rulers and freehand. I admit I like the look of ruler quilting with this design because it makes it formulaic. It makes all the lines the same, and as it lines up on your quilt, especially when it's stitched through the borders, it really has a nice formal look, and I love that. It is a little bit on the time-consuming side, as I explained in this video, but you know, when you have that really special quilt, it's absolutely worth it. So that's it for this video. I hope that you enjoy more videos during Grace Company's Spring Fling Quilt Festival. Until next time, let's go quilt.
Thank you so much, Leah Day. That was a wonderful video presentation on how to use the Superslide ruler to do the matrix pattern, the matrix design. That is a lot of fun. I'm gonna have to try using that on one of my quilts sometime. I've got the ruler, and I haven't tried doing the matrix yet, so that's gonna have to be on my to-do list. That was the last presentation for Quilt Canada 2021. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. If you are still going to the quilt booth at the CQA website, just so you know, we probably aren't going to be there for a whole lot longer. So best bet to reach us would be to reach out through our toll-free number or comments, and we would be happy to still visit with you. We still have a few hours left, though, that you can get in your orders. Let me just share my screen. So yeah, if we go to our go to the website, we've got a great Quilt Canada page that you can go to. You can then go on and see all of the different promotions we have going on, which are just fantastic. And that might be a little better. Fantastic promotions. Definitely worth going and having a look. If we go back to the home page, our Unique 19 frame, that will be on through the end of the month. All the other promotions will be ending tonight, which is June 19th at midnight. But the Unique 19, that'll be on sale through the end of the month just for you guys. So again, thank you so much for joining us, and I look forward to doing more presentations and visiting with you guys in person soon. All right, bye-bye now.